The Project. Kuwait. Learn, live.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to this episode of Psyched with Dr. D.
Wow, we had an amazing presenter. Khalid Hadeed wrote an article on gender binary, and he says the case against binary gender. It was just amazing. His stories were amazing. His honesty, the way he described gender roles in a different way. I was really amazed at his articulation, intelligence.
This episode will definitely make you think.
Yes.
And just begin to deconstruct the way that we think of gender.
That's right.
Great.
Definitely.
So
listen up. Don't let this pass you. Listen, send us your comments, your rating. We are open to all.
Enjoy.
All this and more in today's episode.
And we're on.
Okay. So
welcome.
Thank you. Should I start by saying my name?
Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Khalid Hadeed. I teach English and comparative literature at Kuwait University, and I've been doing that since 2013. My experience there definitely shaped the way I've come to perceive problems of gender and sexuality in Kuwait. I would say a fair portion of the courses I've taught also dealt with issues of gender and sexuality. All literature really that is, serious, probes social problems in profound ways. And so it's pretty hard to avoid issues related to gender or sexuality or class or race. But specifically for the article that I'm here to discuss today, the background is that I was approached.
Cracking the mold.
Yeah, cracking the mold.
I like
the case against binary gender.
How'd you even come up with a title like that?
The title, well, basically, I was approached by a former student of mine who's now a managing editor at this journal where the article was published, and she asked me to submit an article of my choice on a topic of my choice. And I thought that would be a kind of a productive paradigm within which to write, because it would allow me to approach, the problem of gender identity, but also maybe in a less direct way, the problem of sexual normativity also in Kuwait, and also to tackle the problem of segregation, double standards in gender, right? And but on top of that, segregation in public education, which has been a thorn in my side. It has kind of really, I would say, dimmed or darkened my experience of teaching at the university. The problem of this intensive differentiation between the genders, which just covers a whole spectrum of behaviors and types of speech and types of clothing and different types of access to space. This is a problem that's visible to me on a daily basis everywhere I go, and well, my purpose was, to try to get people to understand that the dominant way that gender works in this society is not really necessarily natural, and that gender is largely a social construct, right? It's something that, you have to be sort of, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but something close, kind of like you have to be programmed from an early age in order to believe that a particular distribution of, let's say, gender identities, right, is something natural, essential, and non-negotiable in the way that a biological reality would be. I don't think Kuwait is unique in kind of having a social structure based on very rigid kind of gender models, let's say. But unlike other countries, and I often use the countries of Western Europe and the US as kind of counterpoints, unlike those countries, there still isn't enough of a space of discourse where we can imagine and talk about alternative models of gender.
Because
right?
I think we're still stuck in seeing gender as biological sex. And we haven't moved past
Yeah.
seeing it through maybe sexual difference. Like when you look at
Right.
Butler and Cixous and all these other theorists that came out, they're not looking at it in this deterministic way.
Yes.
And I think this is a good segue in terms of talking about binaries, because you start your article by talking about binary models and how they seem to be the foundation of patriarchal society. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think for any patriarchal society, a binary approach to gender is necessary because, like other binary approaches, let's say, for example, if we look at race, like, black, white, or if we look at, the religious distinctions that were operative, during the times of the, Christian empires, where it was like either Christian or heathen, for example, right? Having a binary schema by default, it's kind of part of a logic where one member of this binary pair is going to be the superior one, and the other member is going to be the inferior one. The superior member of the binary will have, by default, the right to subjugate the inferior part of the binary. So it's, according to that logic, that, a
Everything
binary,
has to be black and white. Everything has to be high or low.
high or
Yeah.
low, I know, or yeah.
So everything is in a way, it is put into some sort of a scale, either this or that. So I guess binary makes sense when it comes to if people don't understand gender, it's easier to say male qualities, female qualities.
Right, but a bit more than that. It's like, if there's a particular logic of power that is working to shape society in very particular ways, reducing reality really helps.
And that's where
that
Foucault
logic
comes in.
Yeah.
And so you set up this idea of duality in terms of saying that this structure is built on keeping these separate spheres as far away as possible. There can't be any leaks or fissures within male, man, woman, mind, body, black, white. It has to be separate.
Yes.
And so you bring up Foucault and power and knowledge to start to show the cracks. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so Michel Foucault is a French philosopher who's been identified as a post-structuralist. And for the post-structuralists, it was very important for them to, bring awareness to language, not as this transparent and honest kind of medium of representation and communication, but rather as a kind of a system of signs that ultimately works to produce the reality of the society within which it is used. And they went further to argue that language is set up in a way that kind of pushes it to construct reality in a way that fits the current distribution of power.
And that's where he talks about this discursive construction.
Yes.
In terms of it's not biological. It's not you were born in this way. No, it's all of these discursive constructions that make you who you are. And more importantly, it's not coerced. It's not forced upon you.
Right.
It's almost to a point where you start to do the self-surveillance.
Yeah.
To fit into...
Absolutely, yes.
Into this mold.
Yes.
And that's really important because once you start to see gender not as it is, but as it's constructed, you can start to break everything apart.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of an article by Iris Marion Young called Throw Like a Girl, where there was another psychologist. He was looking at the softball game and he said, girls are weaker than men because look at how they throw. They can't throw the ball far enough. So she takes a step back and says, no, but look at how the boy is throwing. He's using his entire body, twisting arm, shoulder, everything to throw the ball. Whereas the girl, it's limited to just her shoulder. And that's indicative of the amount of space that men and women are allowed to have. So whereas men are able to move freely in the world, women are constricted into the smallest limited space possible. So it's not a question of weakness. It was more or less the spatial limit that both were given.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful observation. And I think that this idea that women are like biologically weaker than men is being accepted as a kind of a truism, you know, as an evident reality, because there's less cultural room for women to kind of to develop their physical strength compared to what's available to men. It's just considered more natural and permissible for men to go to the gym a lot, you know, and just work on the development of their physical strength and work in occupations that require physical strength. Whereas if we think of women having the same chance, you know, the general turn of opinion will be, oh, that's so unfeminine, it's so
Yeah, so
unappealing.
masculine.
Why would women want to
Right.
do that to their bodies? You know, it's just more in line with, you know, feminine beauty for women to have
Right.
soft and kind of supple and pliant bodies, you know.
And also the way, you know, when you describe a man, you say, oh, he has muscles, he's strong.
Yeah.
And for a woman, it's very interesting because I was just one of my classes in social psychology. We're talking about gender, and I asked the guys, how many of you would marry a weightlifter or a power lifter, women, right? And none of them put their hand up. And then when I said, why would you not marry someone that, you know, is strong and works out and lifts? One guy said to me, no, I don't want my woman to be stronger than me. And then I was like, okay,
yeah.
but she could be stronger in other ways. It's not just like, you know, her body is stronger, therefore. And then another one said, no, but that's not, it's like, Dr. D, that's not strong. That's not attractive. And why it's not that attractive? Because she's not feminine. Because most of the time when you know, when you describe a woman, you have the more petite she is, the feminine she is, the cute she is.
Because you're
you know?
infantilizing her.
Yeah.
Once you infantilize the female body, you reduce it and therefore can
That's right.
exert power over it.
Yes.
So the less space a woman takes up,
Yeah, that's right.
the more that this patriarchal society can say,
Continues.
see, yeah, but that's it. It's just this constant perpetuation that keeps this binary
That's right.
stable.
Because there is advantages to keeping it that way, right?
Yes.
So the more we continue feeding into this patriarchal society, the more, you know, the patriarchs are happy.
And this whole, you know, this whole like gendering of physical exercise and physical strength that resonates on a personal level with me, because since my childhood, I was never attracted to sports, you know, but I was under pressure to be attracted to sports, you know, and to develop my body in a, you know, as a strong body, you know. But I felt always that I existed more in my mind than in my body. It was never a priority for me, you know. So, on a personal level, it's something that I'd say I would struggle with, and I feel like it's just it's unfair to have that sort of expectation leveled on men, you know, men who don't identify with this kind of
That's right.
with this kind of role, you know.
But
and then there is a pressure, because then if I'm sure as a kid that it, you know, even with my son, like he only likes skating, but he doesn't really do anything sporty, and you know, and his sister's more sporty. So it's like always this kind of pressure. It's like, why don't you like soccer? Why don't you like basketball? Because he's really tall for his age. Every time somebody sees him this tall, they automatically assume, you must be playing basketball. And it's like, no, I don't even like basketball.
Yeah.
You must be, you know, why are you not in football? Why are you not like, you know, and in a way, not asking him like, do you like it or not? But in a surprise way that you're not doing any of that.
Yeah.
While his sister's more active in that way. And he's, you know, they're like, really you? Not him? Like they make these kind of constant comment that there's something wrong with your gender. And then there's something wrong with your gender also. Either way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, this brings me back to the article and the reason why I felt like introducing the theories of Judith Butler about gender performativity would complement the theories of Michel Foucault very nicely. I mean, whereas Michel Foucault, you know, investigates the ways in which language, including, you know, binaries, construct reality, right, as we perceive it. Judith Butler just looks at the kind of the micropolitics of the body and argues that the way we perform our bodies, the types of body language that we assume, the types of clothing we wear, right? All of that goes into defining, the normalcy of our bodies. What is the normal feminine? What is the normal masculine over time, right? And so, like, these expectations surrounding physical strength, physical activity, they come attached with a whole range of other expectations. What is natural for women to wear? What is natural for a man to wear, right? So I lived in the States for 13 years before coming back to Kuwait, and it changed. So I left Kuwait in 2000, and then when I came back, I was just shocked. I was completely shocked at the degree of change, the degree to which the society had taken a conservative turn. And so I felt like, at least on a visible level, right, that the codes defining what's visibly masculine, what's visibly feminine, had really become very restrictive, very limiting. And in the States, I'd just go out or whatever. I'd wear a pendant or I'd wear a bracelet or a ring, and it just wouldn't occur to anyone to just even turn their eyes to me. I wouldn't be a magnet for attention, But as soon as I came here, I noticed that wasn't the case, you're expected to, if you're biologically male, you're expected to dress a particular way, and the same goes for biologically female. Deconstructing binary gender for me is both liberating our minds and liberating our bodies, and kind of giving us room to perceive ourselves in relation to others in a way that is actually reflects reality, much better than the system we currently operate by. Yeah.
And I think that's important. It's once you start to understand that this isn't written in stone, that you can perform it differently. There's this freedom that comes from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm not normal. Why am I feeling this way? Why do I want to do this? Why do I not want to play sports? Why do I just... Then you can start the self-acceptance as well.
Yes.
Right. That's
and
true.
really move forward.
Very true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the important,
Yeah.
that we can normalize a lot of things, and instead of having to say that, oh, you don't like sports, so there must be something wrong with you. Or, you're too masculine for a girl, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that this is really, if you think about it, small children, this really affects their identity, and that affects their perception of who they are. And this idea of questioning, am I really normal? Is it true, Mom, that girls are only supposed to do this? And I feel like, when you say to them, no, I don't, it doesn't matter. You should be who you want to be. Even you as a parent, you get mocked, because then other people that hear that are saying, what is wrong with you as a mom? You're not supposed to say that to them.
Yeah.
You are ruining them. You're allowing them to, to become different. You're opening up the door for them to be gay. You're opening the door for...
Yes.
And this constant connotation of the pressure that a parent feels, nevertheless, the pressure the kids are feeling.
Yeah.
It's like the nail polish incident.
It's a nail polish incident.
Right?
Yeah, you got to tell.
I don't know if we've talked about
Khalid
this.
about the nail polish incident.
So my son comes up to me one day and says, I want to put red nail polish on my feet. Cool. Great. Red's one of your favorite colors. Let's do it. Then he says, okay, Mom, I want to paint my fingernails. And I'm okay with that. Like, I give him the safe space at home, but I also had to prepare him for what might happen when he steps out of his safe space. And like, my son will walk around saying, no gender discrimination, in a joking way, but I had to sit him down and say, listen, you can wear nail polish. It's your body. As long as it's not harming anybody else, you can do what you want. But there might be kids that come up to you and laugh at you.
Yes.
There might be kids that come up and say nail polish is just for girls.
Yes.
And I gave him the list of what might happen. And I said, your response is, it is my body and I can do what I want. So I gave him the choice. I said, if you are willing to follow through with any of these things, I'll paint them. If not, I won't. He eventually followed through and wanted to do it. But I don't like that I had to give him this. I had to preface a simple thing as painting his nails.
Yeah, I
Like a disclaimer,
understand.
yeah.
But, from the perspective of a protective parent, I think it's sensible to do that in a social setting like what we have in Kuwait. Because if you're someone who is outside of the norm, you can easily fall victim to predatory kind of behaviors. And, one thing that I think I bring out in my article is that in order for any system, right, to remain in place, in this case, the system of gender, there has to be an active process of like policing, right? Policing the boundaries. And policing the boundaries happens how? It happens whenever you notice someone kind of acting in ways that really don't fit within the boundaries laid down for them, you police that person, and you police them by, abusing them verbally or physically, marking them out as an outsider, coming up with, marginalizing expressions for them, kind of representing them as the odd exception, bullying, etc. So policing measures, I feel like, are very active in our society. And there's a spectrum between, subtlety to like, direct kind of oppression, and subtlety can be like, looking askance at someone and just like, giving or looking them up and down, to show them that you don't approve of what you're wearing, of what they're wearing. So it's,
Do you think this
it's-
policing happens because there's fear of the unknown or fear of...
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. So I feel like any social system that is really built on rigid binaries, like where there's continuity is not allowed, that kind of system is actually in practice, I would say it's impossible to actually implement in any thorough and honest way. Like it's impossible even for, let's say, a man who identifies as biologically and psychologically male to fit in with, the privileged part of this binary 100%. Because there's a kind of idealistic kind of exaggeration on both sides of the binary. What it means to be masculine, like it is expressed in an ideal kind of archetypal way. And the same goes for what it means to be feminine, right? And no one can really embody these ideals. They remain as ideals, The most we can do is approximate those ideals. So whenever someone who identifies himself, let's say we're talking about men now, if I'm a man and I identify myself with the privileged side of this binary as a typical male, let's say an alpha male, right? That identity would by default be in excess of what is, I don't want to say natural in the sense of biological, but, what is reasonable of us to expect. Okay, let's say. So when you see another male body behaving outside of this narrow box to which you've accustomed yourself on the basis of which you've built your entire identity, your reaction will be fear, right? So I think a lot of abusive behavior, a lot of bullying comes out of the fear that the dominant majority experiences, to keep the socials, a rigid social system, to keep it within the rigid shape that it currently has, as much as you can, you need to keep on excluding difference and making difference a more intimidating kind of experience, a more fearful experience.
Yes, and that's why there is policing, as you were saying, because if we see difference, then we're intimidated by it.
Yes.
And we become intimidated, and that's what encourages people to be policing.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you think about bullying, it's all about targeting the ones that are different.
Yes.
Targeting the weak or targeting the boy that, is not fitting into the masculine characteristics, or the girl that's not feminine enough, or the kid that has disability of some sort, physical or mental.
Right.
Or the ones that are seen as passive.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because everything on the outside, the marginalized, the abject, all of it just threatens the stable system.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's exactly the point, threatening.
Mm-hmm. That's it. It shows that it's not black and white, that it is this spectrum, and that people can flow in and out of this. And so that's where all of this violent behavior comes from. And it's either in the form of the dominant inflicting this, or even it could be from the self. Like you've seen people that don't fit do like policing themselves.
Right, to make
Yes,
sure that they fit
absolutely.
within the norm. But I mean, let's just be realistic. The idea is that, we can't just blame people the way they feel or act, because this is the way that they were brought up. And, if you all your life have been brought up with certain criterias, binary, as you can say, and to be able to recognize that this is what is norm, to later on come back and start accepting that, yes, you've learned it all the way like this, but now we're telling you something else.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult.
It is. Yeah, it takes a lot of effort to
a lot of education.
Decondition someone,
yes. And I'm not sure, like we said, is to decondition someone is like they have to have the ability, the education, the acceptance. And I'm not sure if the majority of the population has that.
So Maddie always talks about me on the show. It's my chance to actually talk about him. So Mehdi's in a very privileged position.
Yeah, he's heterosexual,
he's white
white
in
male.
The States. He's Arab here. He's very comfortably heteronormative.
Yeah,
loves sports. Like he is in the prime position.
Well, isn't he in the first tier? That's what the first tier is, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And so when I started my process of unlearning, their language is important. And I try to show him that the words he says matter.
Yeah, especially with Maddie. Like he'll say something he doesn't realize it.
But every time I try to kind of check his privilege, he's open to it, but not when I went full headfirst into my process of unlearning. Him, not so much. It's baby steps. And because what happens when you're in that privileged position,
why give it up?
When you start, but that's it.
Yes.
That's exactly it.
I wouldn't give it up.
Now you're saying,
what's his motive to give it up?
Absolutely nothing.
Right. So
yeah. And so that's it's an interesting
it's a threat.
thing. It is. So that's it. I want to say that about
So-
Mehdi because he always talks about me. Now I can talk
but
about
it's
him.
true. It's a
It is,
threat
yeah.
for him.
And he's changing some things, but I can't expect a full-blown carryover.
But how do you deal with it, though? Because you're trying to raise your son
I am.
to not fit into...
That's true. But guess who wins most of the time?
You, thank
Guess
God.
what? Sorry, I didn't get
Guess
that.
She
who
wins.
Yeah.
I'm with him most of the time. So, because for me, it's really important.
So painting his toenail red was no problem?
I want my son to be a feminist in
Yeah.
terms of for everybody, equality for everybody. He's already had like a nice little check in the privilege department by being a boy. So I want him to be an ally and to understand things. I don't want him to be in that position and take it for granted, is what I'm saying. And for him to understand, just if you want to paint your nails, you can paint your nails. It takes nothing from you. It is your body. But at the same time, you have to respect other people's bodies. Like I'm already teaching him consent, just in terms of don't hug anybody unless they want to be hugged. But at the same time, you have the right to say no if somebody is trying to hug you.
Yeah.
And I think these are just small things that are so important because then he doesn't have to unlearn it later on.
Yes.
It's already there in the foundation. And when Mehdi says boys and girls, DJ yells, no gender segregation. So that makes me very happy.
That's nice.
That's true, though.
You know, it's something that I knew that I wanted to do right from the beginning. And I've seen other children that are so indoctrinated.
Oh, that's the problem.
And
those are the ones I see at the university.
you don't even know where to start. And it kind of leads me into another point you brought up when you were saying that these gender binaries actually have effects on public education.
Yes.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, okay. So on a more immediate level, what struck me when I first started teaching at the university in the fall of 2013 was the percentage of female students who were abiding by a very restrictive interpretation of the religious Islamic dress code. And so these were girls, let's say between 18 to 22 years of age, basically wearing black from head to toe, and, the kind of message that this way of dressing sends out. And I'm not saying this because I have, let's say, a clear idea or a rigid kind of ideology concerning what people should or shouldn't wear. But I mean, that kind of visual, let's say, language, it sends out a message, which is that the female body is, by default, is naturally sexualizable, right? And therefore, it has to be protected from that kind of essential vulnerability by this strong visual kind of veil, or visual kind of a form of concealment that says to the viewer, no, don't look at me, kind of, it just creates a kind of protective barrier. And it was a bit disappointing and demoralizing for me to see the extent to which this uniform kind of culture of dressing had spread. It seemed to me that we'd gotten to a point where, now there's this dominant kind of culture of dressing, this dominant dress code that is getting reproduced, right, from generation to generation in a way that doesn't leave room for people as individuals to question it. Is this what I want to do? Does this reflect the way I think about myself, the way I perceive myself, the way I want to be in this world, And after I got over this initial kind of, let's say, this feeling of being unsettled, right? And I would get to talk with many of my female students, many of whom were veiled. And I realized that even a large percentage of the students who were wearing the hijab were doing so, not necessarily out of their own conviction, but some of them were doing it, under pressure from their parents. Some of them were doing it kind of just because it would make their lives easier for them to fit in with other girls in their own, age range. And others were doing it, to feel like to make themselves more, let's say, appealing in the marriage market, So, I mean, for me, these are all really not good reasons, to adopt a dress code that ultimately it sends a message that the female body possesses a sexuality that should be concealed, there's something taboo about it that, that shouldn't be visually accessible, let's say, So that's one side of, one aspect of the kind of binary gendering that I found deeply troubling. Male students they don't have to, they aren't by default subjected to these kinds of expectations. They're free to more or less to present their bodies in less restrictive ways. I mean, that's not to say that they aren't bound by certain expectations as well, but the visual language that the culture makes available to their bodies isn't as restrictive,
And can you imagine the message that, I mean, the thing is, yes, they don't have to feel, or that they don't really have a dress code. I like your word. But I think that, for example, they can wear shorts, and when we have very hot weather, I see my students coming in and they've got shorts, or even, kind of a sleeveless shirt or tank top or whatever they call it. But then for us, the girls don't. And if she does wear anything then she's seen, and this is like private university, she's seen as the loose girl.
Yes.
Right?
But there's always been a policing of the female body because what it represents.
That's right.
I mean, if we go back to duality, if we have mind and body,
we might take over the world, and God forbid.
No, but then when you have the Cartesian duality, man and mind are elevated as one, and women and body were kind of grouped up into the same thing because of the body is also another like act of defiance in regards to this duality because of what it does, especially the female body and the permeability of the female body. So how women get pregnant and how they lactate and how they menstruate. It's just all of these like leaky fluids within the female body represent everything that the typical patriarchal structure does not want exposed. So the more that you cover up this permeable body, the nice and stable and quiet the system remains. So it's almost taking this denigration of women to a full blown, just now we can't see these changes, like these small little acts of defiance to the system.
Right, it's true.
I like, that you mentioned permeability. I think that's really essential for us to understand patriarchal systems. And the way that sexual orientation often gets perceived, experienced, kind of mapped out by people in this country, but also in the larger like Middle East and Mediterranean region, really I feel revolves around this issue of permeability versus impermeability. So compared to, Western kind of organizations of epistemic, knowledge-based organizations of sexuality, the distinction here doesn't seem to be so much homosexual, heterosexual, as opposed to penetrating and penetrable, right? And so you hear a lot of stories about, coming out of, like, say, the public school context, where you have all male schools and all female schools. A lot of stories of, sexual assault, rape, coming out in the setting of the boys' schools. And, there it's considered, as long as you're the one, doing the act of penetration, that, your masculinity is still intact, and if you're in the opposite side, if you're getting penetrated, then you lose your masculinity and with it your honor, right? And that kind of model, it persists, I feel, even into adulthood. I mean, at least compared to societies in Europe and the States, we still have like forms of bonding and forms of social bonding, forms of physical bonding that don't fit neatly with the dichotomy between homosexual and heterosexual that we find in the West, But they also involve levels of coercion and violence that are like more subtle, that take us back to the issue of permeability, right? And permeability doesn't have to be just about the body. It can also be about, your emotions, so you're expected here to project your personality in a very extroverted kind of, some often aggressive way. I'm always strong. I don't express my emotions so much, Yeah, so I feel like there are many ways of understanding what it means to be homosexual, heterosexual, or anything in between, But the way to make sense of the, the cultural differences and the definitions of what is homosexual, heterosexual, we need to understand how power is distributed in any particular society. And in order to understand that, we need to look at the language being used, to describe gender identity and sexual relations and sexual identity and orientation in each society, Yeah. So.
That's true. And you also talked about transsexual, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of like, how they are understood here. And also going back to that idea of, because they don't fit in any criteria, male, female, and how the society mistreats them in a way.
Yes.
Because again, they don't, since as we said earlier, if you don't fit a particular category, then they have to be violated because you are not within the norm.
Yes, they have to be policed, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, the suffering of transgender people is just heartbreaking in itself here. It's ongoing and it's backed by the law. In 2007, there was an amendment to Article 198 of the Penal Code. Initially, this article just criminalized behavior that was deemed to be public behaviors that were deemed to be offensive to public morals, I mean, it was a very kind of loosely defined kind of
Right.
law.
I didn't know really.
Right?
2007?
In 2007, there was an amendment to the law adding this clause
That there.
that, basically adding to the, well, there wasn't a list actually. It was just any behavior, that offended public morality. But added to that clause in 2007, what they added to that clause was, anyone impersonating the other gender, right?
So if you're impersonating a woman, then you are committing a crime.
Yes.
And if you're picked by the police, then
Yes.
you are an offender.
Yes, and the legal penalty allowable for that is up to a year of imprisonment and or 1,000 KDs as a fine.
For every time they catch you.
Yes, for every time they catch you. And I've heard many
And I
stories
heard that they get beaten.
Yes, I've heard many stories about, individuals who appear to be kind of dressed in a transgender kind of way, getting apprehended by the police and taken.
Transgender kind of way. So it's not really a true transgender.
I mean, no, we're
So
not. We're not. In the article, I didn't address specifically the issue of transsexuals and gender reassignment surgery.
Oh no, because we don't do it yet. But do you know it is legal in some of the Gulf countries, like Bahrain is, Oman is.
I know that it was legal in Iran. I wasn't aware that.
No, because if they have been, if you can prove the idea, if you can prove that it's a medical situation, then it's validated. Anyways, going back, so they really get picked up. But the problem is that normal people call the police on them. So it's not like the police seeing them. So we go back to that policing.
Yes.
Somehow in the community, some people think that they are responsible to report.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I think that goes to show you that, how widely diffused this rigid binary system is, because it's not being really imposed by the state onto the citizens so much as it is. I see it more as a kind of, let's say, maybe a feedback loop or just a kind of a flow, a regular flow, from the majority of the society to the politicians and the legislators, and incidents like this one that the Human Rights Watch reporter was covering, right, where transgender people were getting basically exposed to the police by citizens. These cases show us that deviating from this binary gender script, it just poses a threat to most people in general. And what's interesting is that you hear a lot of stories of transgender people who get assaulted and even physically and sexually assaulted by the police when they get apprehended. And what does that say to you? If you're a representative of the country and you're supposed to be protecting its moral fabric, and you capture someone who is supposedly, corrupting that moral fabric, and you're punishing them in a sexual way. So you're initiating sexual contact that by default makes you, part of the deviancy, quote unquote, of this person that you're policing. So what does that tell you about this dominant ideology? For me, it says that dominant ideology is fake. At least it's not consistent with the honest human experience. It's something artificial. It's something imposed. And picking on individuals who very visibly are outside of the norm is an opportunity for people who stay safely within the norm to vent the frustrations they accumulate over time from feeling inside of themselves that the norm is actually a very heavy kind of expectation to live by. It's a very heavy expectation to live by. If you're expected as a man to keep your more vulnerable feelings bottled up all the time, right? To keep your attraction maybe to other men kind of repressed all the time, it's heavy. And so when you find someone that is, visibly outside of the norm that you're abiding by, that's an opportunity for you to become a predator, And I mean, going back to the university, I felt like,
Is that what we call homophobic?
yeah, I mean, homophobic, but also
I mean, we all
kind of,
know the research about homophobic that it says that,
you could say homophobic or transphobic, even,
or transphobic.
But I mean, the point I was trying to kind of distill out of these stories is that, even for people who speak the language of power and, act the acts of power, we shouldn't jump to assume that they are powerful.
Yeah,
right?
it's true. Or that they're just acting as.
Actually, but we would be safe in assuming that the language of power, the discourse of power, is stronger than they are. And I think every single person, whenever we behave in a conformist way, whenever we give the language of power what it is dictating to us, we are reinforcing the power of that language, giving it more power to keep on dictating to us how we should act and how we should live. And it's in that sense that, gendered scripts of behavior, models of gender, become dominant. To the extent that we do conform to them, we give them the power that actually we possess in ourselves. And then, ironically, it backfires against us, Yeah. So yeah, in my experience in the university, it was just kind of an experience of, I guess you could say, a bit of a cognitive dissonance, It's like I'd see these students, okay, I'm sure you know that practically speaking, this law that they come up with, I believe it was in 1996, of implementing gender segregation in all institutions of higher education, public institutions of higher education. Yeah. It just wasn't feasible on a practical level. It would just involve too much money,
Right. That's why they try to impose it on the private sector. And, like it was imposed twice. And it's not feasible. So the first time because I wrote a paper on gender segregation when it first happened, 2007 or 8, when they tried to impose it to private sector. And, and then of course we had to do it. I remember when I first started at the university, we have partitioners, like they're like small things in the middle. I don't know if Haya remembers, but they were like in the middle where we had to put girls on one side, guys. Yeah. But then we're in the same room, because we're a small university, and when at that time, and there's not enough professors, so I have to teach for boys and girls, but they have to be. Yeah. And then after that, I don't know what happened. Then we came back to norm, and then they were trying to impose it again.
Yes.
Because I don't know, because of the public has it, so they assumed that we would have it too, private sectors. But the thing is that they were segregating. It's the same thing as your universities. You're segregated in the classroom, but actually in the main areas, you're not.
Thank you. Yes. So I was trying I was aiming to get to that point, because it just highlights to you the whole, the dysfunctional nature of the system and the hypocritical nature of the system.
Yeah, exactly. That's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. It's like you can't be saying to me, and that's exactly what the argument is like, okay, so you want me to teach for two different, for boys and girls, they're all in my class. But then after that, no, they weren't satisfied. They had to remove, or, and then they have to be in different classes. Well, if you only have 2 psychology teachers, there's no way, and I'm only supposed to teach certain number of classes, then we wouldn't be able to do it. Right. But then, like I said, our diner, our Starbucks, everything else is like, mixed.
Yeah. You can't force people to interact with only members of their own gender outside.
What is the rationale? I don't understand the rationale. Of course, some people describe it or explain it using religion, but I don't think that that's, that could be possible, because the idea is that we don't live in a bubble and we don't work in. Now, sometimes you might get lucky if you went to all segregated school and then get segregated jobs. But nowadays, we don't even have segregated jobs.
No, we don't. No.
No.
I think the way I try to make sense of it, I don't think it's rational, but I think it's there's a twisted rationale behind it. And I mentioned this in my article, where I say that, there's this idea that is kind of being circulated by people who, I'm going to put religious in square quotes because it's not, I mean, their thoughts aren't coming out of any spiritual or religious, even religious place, as far as I'm concerned. But there's this idea that, so males and females are biologically, psychologically distinct, and it's in the nature of things. It's in the nature of things for them to gravitate towards each other because they're distinct and complementary. And up to the age of marriage, young men, young women, boys and girls should be protected from interacting freely with each other because that might make room for kind of, for extramarital, premarital kind of sexual attachments or involvements,
Right. So we have to protect them.
And ironically, I think what that ends up doing in practice, right? First, so one of the things it does is that it leads to the establishment of single gender public schools, right? Where you see sexual tension build up to the point of harassment, which is very unhealthy. So you see boys harassing boys in the schools, and then you see boys harassing girls, men harassing women out in the streets in very aggressive ways, very dangerous ways, like harassing them while they're driving, for example,
And the more you say no, the more they follow you.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, if you want to legislate to that extent, how young girls, boys, or young men or women interact with each other, you're going to get some pretty negative consequences. So what you're doing, the more you separate them, the more you encourage each to think of the other mostly in sexual terms, rather than, a fellow human being with an amazing, rational capacity.
Right, and the two people could be colleagues or could work together without having, I have a lot of colleagues and I don't think sexually of them. And that's probably because I was raised all my life in the US, where, the genders were treated equal and we all have, everything was normalized. You go to school with other, that is mixed, and you work with mixed schools, you go to university with mixed. So it becomes the norm that now I have a lot of colleagues who are males. But, in academia, it seems like more males than females. And, we could sit and have coffee, we can talk. It's never crossed my mind that any of them would be more than that. So I feel like you're right. I think whenever we push this segregation and, so I did a paper recently also. I did one 2008 and published it, and that was only for private universities. And then I did one later on, like 2 years ago, it was published. And it's a gender segregation. And this time I wanted to evaluate, to look at the public, like we did it at Kuwait University. And then we did it at AUK. Private versus public. And we were thinking that the public probably would, that they would want to be segregated and that they would be comfortable with segregated school. And what we come to find out is that it's not true. That even students that were at KU that did our survey for us, has expressed the interest of wanting to be in a mixed school.
Yeah.
And then there was no rationale for them. And then we were trying to think about where did they get the idea of like trying to be. And a lot of responses were more like, they were raised, even with their family gatherings, they were segregated. They were raised to, the idea that males and females don't mix. They were raised the idea that it is wrong to have friends that are of the opposite gender. So a lot of them were raised in that mentality that only made it, okay to be going to segregated school.
Right.
So it's can you imagine from the beginning if I'm told that no, you're not supposed to go to school with the opposite gender, as if like they're trying to say to me that something is wrong here, that the two of you should not be mixed.
Right.
And it's already building an image in my mind that this is something bad.
Yeah.
Taboo. We don't do it,
Yeah, there are many issues with that. I mean, on a logical level, that kind of cultural prohibition is based on the assumption that all males will be sexually attracted to females and vice versa.
That's right. And then they can't be trusted. You can't trust males.
Right.
Because if they're around you, they might violate you. We look the same way we're looking at intimacy and sex. It's like,
Right. And then the other thing that develops out of this kind of prohibition is that young men are taught to think of young women as primarily sexual beings and vice versa, kind of. And that creates a culture that is ironically oversexed, I would say,
Yeah. That's right.
So the supposedly religious place out of this, out of which this prohibition is coming, is in effect hypersexualizing the whole culture, So there's just a level of logical inconsistency and hypocrisy, I think, that's involved here, because I'm not even sure if the people putting these laws in place actually believe in what they're doing. I think it's a way for them to control society, to see themselves as having the power to dictate to people how they live. And I also feel like controlling desire is it's a profound way of controlling human beings in general, because like people recognize at some level that desire is a powerful motivating factor for just other areas of life, not just sexuality, And so controlling desire is a way of controlling many other things as well, So yeah, I mean, that's how I feel about, binary gender in Kuwait. And that's why I was really motivated to write about it in the context of Kuwait.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
This was a very informative episode.
Okay.
Right?
And that's true. And it really brings a lot of light. And I think we touched on a lot of things that people are thinking.
So if anybody has any questions, please DM us, send us an email, and what does Mehdi usually say? Leave a review to get a free t-shirt or all of that. Thank you again.
This one of the article is Cracking the Mold, the Case Against Binary Gender, and it's published in the 31st issue of the magazine Khalid, which is available online on www.khalidesk.com. Khalid spelled with QUE at the end. Okay? That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. You can also find us on Instagram at The Project Kuwait. Thank you, and join us next time.